The sun, a fiery disk above the parched mesas, was already painting the sky in hues of orange and violet when the sound ripped through Dusty Gulch. It wasn't the usual clang of the blacksmith's hammer or the distant bleating of sheep. This was deeper, more resonant, a sound that vibrated through the very soles of one's boots. A low, grinding groan culminated in a final, definitive clunk. Every head in town snapped upwards. The clock tower, the proud sentinel of Dusty Gulch, stood frozen. Its hands, usually a steady march across the weathered face, were locked at 10:15. Leo, already halfway up the dusty main street with a fresh bucket of water for the saloon's troughs, stopped dead. A knot tightened in his stomach. The clock, the town's heartbeat. Within minutes, the usual morning rhythm began to unravel. Old Man Hemlock burst from the general store, clutching a sack of flour. "Blast it all! I'm late for the noon train, aren't I? But the clock says, wait, what does it say?" He squinted up, his brow furrowed with confusion. Mrs. Gable, usually punctual for her baking, realized her bread wasn't rising. "My dough! The yeast needs warmth at precisely 11, not whatever time this is." Silas, perched on his usual bench outside the mercantile, grumbled, running a gnarled hand through his sparse gray hair. "Never trusted that fancy contraption. Always said a man's gut was a better clock than any gears and springs." Yet even his usual cynicism couldn't mask the underlying unease. The predictability of his day, the very fabric of his routine, had been yanked out from under him. He missed his customary 11 o'clock nap more than he'd admit. Later that morning, the disarray bled into Sheriff Thompson's weekly town meeting. The air in the dusty schoolhouse was thick with agitation, not just the usual complaints about stray dogs and watering rights. Sheriff Thompson, a man whose patience was as thin as the local topsoil, banged his gavel. All right, settle down, folks. Now, about the new well." A chorus of interruptions erupted. "Sheriff, what time is it anyway?" "My appointment with Doc Miller was for 10:30, but I reckon that clock up there is a liar." "Is it lunchtime yet?" "My stomach thinks it's noon, but the sun looks like, well, it looks like this." Thompson sighed, rubbing a hand over his tired eyes. "Look, the clock's broken. We know. Leo's already looking into it." He glared pointedly at Silas, who was making a show of pulling a tarnished pocket watch from his vest. "And Silas, your watch is 2 hours slow, so don't even start." Silas merely snorted, tucking the watch away with a defiant shrug. "At least it moves." Leo, who had indeed spent the morning circling the base of the tower, examining the visible gears with a worried frown, felt the weight of the town's silent expectation. He had a knack for fixing things, but this felt different, bigger. The silence from the clock tower was more than just a lack of chimes. It was a gaping hole in the town's very pulse. The air felt heavier, the sunlight less certain. Dusty Gulch, without its timekeeper, felt adrift. The whistle shrieked, a triumphant blast slicing through the arid air of Dusty Gulch. With a rhythmic hiss of steam and a groan of metal, the Iron Serpent, Locomotive 77, chugged to a halt beside the weathered platform. The last wisp of smoke dissipated into the bright morning sky precisely as the sun crested the jagged peaks to the east. Leo, his uniform jacket still crisp despite the journey, hopped down from the cab, his boots thudding softly on the packed earth. He consulted his prized possession, a heavy silver pocket watch, its face gleaming in the nascent light. The hands rested exactly on 7 o'clock. Another run, precisely on schedule. As the passengers disembarked, a low hum of confusion, rather than the usual chatter of greetings, drifted towards Leo. Men in dusty hats squinted at the sky, women wrung their hands, and a small boy wailed about missing supper. The source of their distress quickly became apparent. The grand clock tower, the pride of Dusty Gulch, stood silent and still, its hands frozen at 2:15. It had been broken for weeks, apparently, and the town had descended into a temporal muddle. "Anyone know what time it is?" a burly miner shouted, his voice rough with frustration. "Lost track days ago," another replied, throwing his hands up. "This whole town's gone loco without that clock." Leo watched, a quiet observer. He saw the genuine anxiety etched on their faces, missed appointments, cold meals, children sent to bed too early or too late. It wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a disruption to the very rhythm of their lives. He felt a familiar stir of compassion. His train, his runs were built on precision, on the unyielding march of time. To see a whole community adrift was unsettling. He slipped a hand into his breast pocket, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth metal of his watch. It was no ordinary timepiece. Passed down through generations of conductors, it had been meticulously calibrated, its inner workings set not by earthly clocks, but by the steady, immutable turning of the stars. It was his anchor, his North Star in a world of shifting sands and hurried schedules. A plan began to form in his mind, a quiet resolve hardening his kind features. This wasn't just about getting his train back on the tracks. It was about steadying a ship adrift. He would help Dusty Gulch find its way back to the present, with a final glance at the broken clock tower, its motionless hands mocking the bustling confusion below. Leo unclipped the watch from its chain. The silver gleamed, a beacon of order in the rising chaos. The first blast caught Silas mid-shave, the razor clattering against his porcelain basin. A long, insistent shriek. It cut through the morning's usual murmur of distant braying and the clink of a blacksmith's hammer. 10 o'clock. Precisely. Leo, perched in the cab of the Iron Serpent, consulted his pocket watch, a weighty silver disc passed down from his grandfather. He'd polished its glass until it shone like a tiny moon. Down in Dusty Gulch, heads popped out of doorways, some with sleepy eyes, others with expressions of startled indignation. Young Martha, usually late for her morning chores, had already spilled half a bucket of water by the well, her jaw slack. The whistle wasn't just a sound, it was a declaration. A new rhythm for a town that had been drifting. Untethered from the sun, Silas stomped out onto his porch, lather still clinging to his jowls. What in tarnation was that boy? Trying to wake the dead? Leo leaned out, a friendly, almost apologetic grin on his face. "Just letting folks know the time, Mr. Silas. 10 o'clock on the dot." Silas grumbled, retreating indoors to finish his shave, but he found himself glancing at his own, long, silent grandfather clock. The thought, unwelcome as a rattlesnake in a boot, occurred to him. The boy was right. It was 10. As the days turned, the Iron Serpent became more than just a means of transport. It became the town's pulse. The deep, guttural chug-chug that signaled its 3 o'clock return from Sterling Pass became a reliable marker. Children, released from school, would race to the tracks, their cheers a welcome for the engineer. Shopkeepers adjusted their lunch breaks, farmers timed their milking, all to the steady, rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the locomotive nearing the station. One particularly moonless night, a frantic knocking roused Leo from a fitful sleep. It was old Mrs. Gable, clutching her shawl. "My stove, Leo! The damper! I can't tell if it's too open or closed. It feels like midnight, but my pie needs to come out at 9. Leo, ever patient, grabbed his brightest lantern. Its polished brass gleamed, and the wick, trimmed with care, cast a powerful, steady beam. He swung it once, a wide, slow arc that painted the front of Mrs. Gable's cabin in a fleeting yellow glow. 9 o'clock, Mrs. Gable, he said, his voice calm. He swung it again, a double flash this time. The train's due to depart at 10, so you've got an hour. Mrs. Gable blinked, the light catching a tear in her eye. 9 o'clock. Thank you, Leo. Thank you. The lantern swings became another language. A swift triple flicker at dusk meant the general store was closing. A single, high swing from the caboose at dawn told the early risers the first shipment of supplies was on its way. Silas, despite his initial protests, found himself subconsciously anticipating these signals. He might not admit it aloud, but the whistles and the lanterns, Leo's new clocks, were bringing a comforting order back to Dusty Gulch. And perhaps a tiny, grudging piece of his heart appreciated it. The usual saloon symphony, clinking chips and low murmurs, shattered when Silas's roar erupted in the Dusty Horseshoe. "A train ain't no clock," he bellowed, slamming his tin mug. A few patrons glanced up, then quickly returned to their games, well acquainted with the old prospector's frequent tirades. But Silas was undeterred. "Leo's got us thinking the North Star's our dinner bell," he scoffed, his calloused hand carving arcs in the air. By the bar, Leo, quietly buffing a glass, sighed. He'd anticipated this outburst. Silas, perpetually scowling and fiercely wary of anything modern, had been a constant irritant since the town clock's gears had seized. "It's a system, Silas," Leo said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the saloon's din. "The runs are timed, engineers follow a schedule, and everyone hears the whistle." Silas snorted. "Timed? You mean precisely when it feels like it. A whistle ain't a chime, boy. A proper clock. That's what a town needs, not some iron horse huffing and puffing on a whim." He pivoted to a small cluster by the fireplace, their faces dancing in the firelight. "Don't you go trusting that train for your schedules, folks," he warned, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Leo's got a good heart, sure, but his head's in the clouds. Star-timed runs? What happens when the fog rolls in, or when the engineer stops for a stretch?" Martha, a seamstress renowned for her intricate needlework, furrowed her brow. "But Leo said the morning run is always at dawn, and the evening at dusk. It's been quite dependable, Silas." "Dependable as a coyote in a hen house," Silas retorted, his eyes narrowing. "You think a schedule etched in starlight can withstand a flash flood? Or a runaway freight car? Our lives hang on time, Martha. Planting, harvest, the stagecoach departures. You want to hand that over to a locomotive's caprice?" He leaned closer, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Just the other day I heard young Billy missed his shift at the smithy, waiting for the noon whistle that never quite materialized when he expected." A ripple of murmur spread through the small group. Elias, who ran the general store, scratched his chin. "Billy did seem a bit late yesterday, now that you mention it. Said he thought the morning run had been delayed." Leo winced. He'd explained to Billy that while the morning run was indeed at dawn itself subtly shifted with the seasons. It wasn't a static, precise hour like a clock's chime. Silas, of course, had seized on this nuance, twisting it into a stark failure of the system. The seeds of doubt, once sown, were beginning to sprout, fostering small confusions that, in a town reliant on precision, threatened to blossom into genuine problems. The sky, a moment before a pale, washed-out blue, bruised into a bruised purple, then a swirling, angry ochre. A low groan, like the earth itself sighing in protest, rumbled through Dusty Gulch before the first tendrils of sand snaked through the air. Within minutes, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of gritty fury. The wind howled, a banshee's cry, tearing at hats and whipping loose planks. Visibility plummeted to mere feet, the familiar outlines of the saloon and general store blurring into indistinct, menacing shadows. Leo, wiping a fresh layer of grit from his eyes with a gloved hand, peered through the swirling chaos from the depot's meager shelter. He could barely make out the end of the platform, The storm was a beast, roaring and thrashing, and he knew it would throw off even the most seasoned traveler. His pocket watch, clutched in his palm, felt impossibly heavy. The meticulous schedule, once a comfort, now seemed an arbitrary decree against the raw power of nature. A figure hunched against the wind stumbled out of the swirling murk towards the saloon, his silhouette briefly illuminated by the flickering oil lamp within. It was Silas, his usually ruddy face streaked with dust, a grimace etched deep. He pushed through the batwing doors, and Leo heard the faint, muffled murmur of voices from inside. A moment later, the door creaked open again, and Silas's voice, surprisingly loud despite the gale, carried on the wind. "Don't you go relying on that young pup Leo for your train times, folks," Silas bellowed, his words barely discernible over the storm's shriek. "Heard him talking about the Basadawari, Iron Horse, coming through late today. Said something about the storm pushing it back till after sunset. Best get your chores done slow, like no rush." Leo's brow furrowed. He hadn't said any such thing. His train was due, storm or no storm, at its appointed hour, a testament to the railway's unwavering commitment. Silas was deliberately sowing confusion, playing on the town's dependency on his old broken clock, and now the oppressive, disorienting nature of the storm. Inside the saloon, the murmurs escalated. "After sunset, you say?" came a voice, thick with worry. "But I need that delivery of flour today." Another chimed in. "Silas knows his trains, always has. If he says late, it's late." The wind gusted, rattling the windows of the depot. Leo clenched his jaw. The dust, thick and pervasive, tasted like frustration. Silas's deception, magnified by the storm's oppressive cloak, was taking root. People, already disoriented by the obscured sun and the howling wind, were grasping at any certainty offered, even if it was false. The sense of time, already fragile in Dusty Gulch, was now utterly adrift, tossed about like a tumbleweed in the gale. Leo knew he had to cut through this deception, but how? When the very air conspired against him, the wind shrieked a mournful dirge, whipping up dust that pricked Leo's eyes and parched his throat. The town square was a maelstrom of ochre and deep shadow, the setting sun a mere bruised smudge behind the dense curtain of airborne grit. It was the kind of tempest that swallowed all sound, isolating you utterly, even amidst others. Panic vibrated through the air, a low thrum beneath the gale's roar. Leo's gaze lifted to the obscured heavens. "Stars always shine, even when you can't see them," his father's voice echoed in his mind, a warm, steadying counterpoint to the storm's ferocity. These words, a bedrock of his youth, offered enduring truth in a world prone to disarray. He drew the intricately carved, polished brass watch from his waistcoat pocket. Its face, usually a miniature cosmos of constellations and a sweeping second hand, now offered only a tiny, reassuring gleam in the deepening twilight. He held it close, its familiar heft a solace. This was more than a mere timepiece. It was a legacy, calibrated to the very firmament, a testament to his father's ingenious craft. His brow furrowed in concentration as he traced the subtle, almost imperceptible dance of the hands, translating celestial motion into terrestrial minutes. The dust storm might veil the sky, but it couldn't alter the precise, unwavering rhythm of the cosmos. He knew precisely where they were. Even now, a flicker of an idea ignited within him, a small but tenacious flame against the encroaching despair. He wouldn't just signal, he would guide. The usual 5 whistles wouldn't penetrate this thick, oppressive air. He needed something more, something that would pierce the gloom and carry across the swirling plains. He pictured the families huddled in their homes, straining for any sign, any sound. Leo began to formulate a plan, He would blow the whistle in sharp, staccato bursts, a pattern repeated every 2 minutes. 10 short, piercing blasts, followed by a pause, then 10 more. That would carry further, its urgency undeniable. And the lantern, it wouldn't just be a steady beacon. He would swing it in wide, deliberate arcs, a silent, luminous pendulum cutting through the dust, a rhythmic flash of hope. 3 wide swings to the left, 3 to the right, then a brief hold, repeating the sequence every minute. It had to be bold, unmistakable. It had to be a promise. He clutched the watch, its steady tick a pulse of resolve against his thumb. The town needed more than time. It needed a compass. And he, with his father's wisdom and his star-time watch, would be it. Silas watched the swirling dust, a harbinger of the coming storm, from his porch, the wind tugging at his worn coat. He'd openly scoffed at Leo's makeshift train schedule, a stopgap until the town clock's repair, yet an unsettling premonition stirred within him. Then it came, the train whistle's sharp, unmistakable cry, followed by a steadily intensifying, rhythmic chug, Leo's signal. Doors across town swung open, figures emerging with a quiet, practiced determination. Not panic. Children, bundled tight, were ushered indoors. Farmers, with an efficiency born of countless seasons, herded their livestock. Even Mrs. Gable, typically a whirlwind of disarray, calmly unpegged her laundry, her movements synchronized with the distant locomotive. Old Man Hemlock, a staunch devotee of the town clock, was already securing his shutters, a faint, almost secret smile playing on his lips. They trusted Leo. They trusted the train. A low rumble escaped Silas's throat. He'd envisioned chaos, proof of a greenhorn's folly. Instead, he witnessed a town moving in seamless concert, a silent ballet choreographed by the approaching engine's steady pulse. There was an undeniable precision to it, a rhythm both alien and surprisingly soothing. The train was always on time, and the town, in turn, was ever ready. The first heavy rain began to fall, sharp drops stinging his cheeks. As he turned to retreat inside, a distressed bleating, mournful and desperately close, snagged his ear. He peered through the deepening gloom, his gaze sweeping the edges of his property. There, huddled beneath a scraggly mesquite, shivered a tiny calf, its woolly coat plastered wetly to its trembling form, bawling pitifully for its mother. It must have strayed from the miller's herd, lost in the wind and fading light. "Blast it all!" Silas grumbled, stomping off the porch. He knew he should simply leave it. It wasn't his responsibility. Yet that vulnerable, lost sound grated on something deep within him. He approached slowly, his voice a low rumble, meant to be gruff but betraying an unintended softness. All right, you little fool. Let's get you back." Startled, the calf scrambled to escape, its legs slipping on the slick earth. Silas, with a sigh more of exertion than irritation, bent down. He scooped up the surprisingly light creature, holding it awkwardly but firmly against his chest. Its small heart hammered against his ribs. The rain intensified, plastering his hair to his forehead. He navigated the muddy path toward the miller's pasture, the calf's soft whimpers a counterpoint to the rising wind. He was soaked, his back ached, and thoroughly annoyed. Still, as he watched the calf nuzzle its relieved mother through the fence, an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the storm's chill. He wiped a hand across his face, unsure if it was rain or something else entirely. The oppressive ochre haze that had choked salvation for days finally began to relinquish its hold. First, a faint, almost imperceptible lightening at the horizon, then a gradual thinning of the gritty curtain that had obscured the sun. Slowly, agonizingly, the world bled back into view. The groaning wind, a relentless tormentor, softened into a mournful sigh. stirring the last tendrils of red dust into lazy, swirling eddies. Buildings, previously indistinct silhouettes, reasserted their sharp lines against a sky that was, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a pale, watery blue. From every porch and doorway, citizens emerged, blinking against a sudden, if weak, light. A collective sigh, deep and resonant, rippled through the main street. Relief, thick and palpable, hung in the air, heavier even than the lingering dust. Then, a cheer erupted, starting as a tentative murmur and quickly swelling into a roar. It was for Leo, standing by the tracks, his lantern still clutched in a dust-caked hand. He'd been their anchor, their only reliable measure of the world outside the storm's fury. His diligent runs, timed by the stars and his internal clock, had kept their days from dissolving into an endless, formless blur. People clapped, some shouted their thanks, a few even wiped tears from their eyes. Leo, a blush creeping up his neck, offered a shy, grateful nod, adjusting the brim of his hat. Silas, ever the last to join any communal display of emotion, emerged from the saloon, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a puddle of thick dust. He squinted at the clearing sky, then at Leo, who was now being clapped on the back by a burly rancher. Silas grumbled, straightening his suspenders. He watched as a young woman, her hair still streaked with fine red grit, approached him tentatively. "Silas, do you know what time it is?" "The clock stopped days ago," she asked, her voice hopeful. Silas, for a moment, seemed to wrestle with himself. He cast a quick glance toward the battered town clock, its hands frozen at 3:30. Then, a peculiar, almost foreign expression softened the usual crags of his face. A faint hint of a smile, a rare bloom, touched the corners of his mouth. "Train time!" he rasped, his voice a little less gruff than usual. He pulled a tarnished pocket watch from his waistcoat, consulted it with a practiced flick of his thumb, and announced, 2:15, train's due in 20 minutes. He paused, then added, almost grudgingly, but with a surprising lack of his usual bluster, "Guess that iron horse does a better job than old Mr. Peterson's springs." The woman's eyes widened slightly at this uncharacteristic admission, and Silas, catching her surprise, quickly reverted to his customary scowl, clearing his throat loudly. He then strode off, leaving her to ponder the quiet revolution that had just taken root in Salvation. The old clock tower in Dusty Gulch stood as a testament to former aspirations, its hands frozen in a permanent state of midday. A group of townsfolk had gathered beneath it, squinting up at the dusty face. Silas, arms crossed, grumbled, "Still ain't ticking, waste of good timber, that whole contraption." "We'll fix it eventually, Silas," Leo said, his voice calm amidst the murmuring. He'd just finished his morning run, the scent of coal and steel still clinging to his denim jacket. "But for now, it seems the engine's doing a fine job, doesn't it?" A chorus of agreements rose from the small crowd. Martha, who ran the general store, chimed in. "Never knew what time it was before. Not really. Now, when Leo's whistle blows, I know it's time to open up." Silas scowled, kicking at a loose stone. "Sounds like we're beholden to a hunk of metal and a man with a schedule." Despite his words, even Silas had found himself unconsciously adjusting his morning routine to the sound of Leo's approaching train. His cows, once milked whenever he felt like it, now saw their pails appear with remarkable regularity. The notion of fixing the venerable clock eventually lingered, a vague promise for a distant future. For now, the rhythm of Leo's train had woven itself into the fabric of Dusty Gulch. Each sunrise brought the distant, familiar shriek of the whistle, a sound that stirred the town from its slumber. Then, a few minutes later, the steady chug-chug grew louder, culminating in the train's majestic arrival, steam hissing like a contented beast. Children would race to the tracks, not just to watch the iron horse, but to catch a glimpse of Leo's sturdy lantern, swinging with a gentle, rhythmic arc as he disembarked. It wasn't just a light, it was the town's personal star-timed clock, its glow marking the precise moment of arrival. "Morning, Leo," someone would call out, and Leo, ever polite, would tip his cap, a quiet pride blooming in his chest. He knew the importance of his route now. More than just delivering goods and passengers, he was delivering time, a reliable pulse for a town that had long lived by the whims of the sun and the shadows. Silas, despite his initial reluctance, found himself listening for the morning whistle. He'd even grudgingly admitted, over a lukewarm cup of coffee, that his day felt more organized now. He wouldn't say it directly to Leo, of course, but the consistency had started to appeal to him. The old prospector, once a creature of habitless wanderings, now found comfort in knowing precisely when the midday meal would be served at the saloon, when the sun would begin its descent, and when the evening quiet would settle over the gulch, heralded by Leo's final departure whistle. Leo continued his runs, the lantern a familiar beacon in the pre-dawn and twilight hours. He carefully maintained its wick, polished its glass, knowing that the humble light was more than just a guide for his path. It was the heart of Dusty Gulch's new star-timed existence. The old clock tower still stood, a silent monument to a bygone era, but the real timekeeper of Dusty Gulch now thundered on steel rails, powered by coal, steam, and the earnest commitment of a man named Leo,